Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next session of CME Palooza Spring. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome you to our 11 a.m. Eastern Time session. This session is called Ideas for Developing Effective Digital Interventions to Change Health Behavior, and this session is sponsored by Educational Measures. Our moderator for this session is Julia Shlovskaya, the Senior Manager of Independent Medical Education and Medical External Affairs at Takeda Pharmaceuticals in Chicago. So we are going to be trying live audience response during this session. This is kind of our pilot. So for those of you who want to participate in this session through the Poll Everywhere platform, you can download the Poll Everywhere app on the Apple Store or on Google Play. And when you open the app, just enter in CME Palooza in the Join Presentation box. Or you can simply open a web browser and go to the URL on your screen here, www.pollev.com/CME Palooza. So we've got a few questions early on in this presentation. Like I said, we're going to see how this works, and hopefully it'll work, and we'll be able to kind of use this moving ahead in the future. So before we begin, as we do before all of our sessions, I would like to acknowledge all the sponsors for CME Palooza Spring. Our gold sponsors, Genentech and ACHL. Our silver sponsors, ASIM, Forefront Collaborative, Educational Measures, Medscape Education, and Peer Audience. As well as all of our bronze sponsors, Catamount Medical Education, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Creative Educational Concepts, Global Education Group, Helio.com Education Lab, Impact Education, Infograph Ed, PrimeEd, Primary Care Network, Real CME, Red Med Ed, RMEI, Bioter Medical Communications, and Vindico Medical Education. So with that, we are going to have the first of our ARS questions. So here is the question. Where are you watching CME Palooza from? So if you see this coming up on your screen, so for folks who are seeing the dots, this is kind of getting a sense of where our audience is watching us from. So we have mostly a domestic audience. I know sometimes we have some folks who are watching this internationally. Unfortunately, the map on the screen is only going to show domestic, the United States. So hopefully people can kind of take a look and click, and we can kind of see where people are watching us from. So there's always a little bit of a tape delay between the live feed of CME Palooza and what the audience is seeing. So that's why there's a little bit of a tape delay with some of these questions. But hopefully this is going to kind of be a good way to get some responses. Okay, so here is our second question. How excited do you get when watching CME Palooza? So here are your choices. More excited than Derek watching a 76ers playoff game? More excited than Scott watching reruns of ALF? Or you guys are lame? So we'll give it a couple seconds to see the responses here as they're kind of coming in. So yes, the as most of the CME Palooza folks who follow us on the blog know, Derek is pretty well invested in the Philadelphia 76ers playoff run right now. So I can definitely speak to his level of excitement as he's watching the games. Okay, so this is how Poll Everywhere works. So you'll kind of see the responses coming in real time as we're going along. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to the slides for a second, and then okay. Okay, so there are 3 ways to ask questions for this and every CME Palooza session. You can use the Educational Measures text line to send in a question, 267-666-0-CME. That's a 0, so 0263. You can click on the Google Slides link that is found on our live page. So just click on the Scott sessions. Or you can tweet your questions to us using the hashtag CME Palooza. And I will be keeping an eye on all of those mechanisms, and hopefully we'll get some good questions throughout this session. Okay, so just keep in mind that the opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions expressed during this session are those of our presenters and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of their employer, its parent company, or their affiliates. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Julia to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott, for the great introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining. We have a really innovative and exciting session today on developing digital interventions to change health behavior. I think a lot of our listeners today are probably aware just how much focus there is nowadays on improving health outcomes and how technology can be leveraged. And as we in industry and academia and societies and medical education providers develop strategies around digital interventions, it's important to share best practices. And so with that said, our really two main goals for today is to introduce everyone to a framework. And what a framework is a step-by-step process that helps to develop the concept or an idea. So we'd like to introduce a framework to you that helps to develop digital interventions that change health behavior. And then our second goal is to have our wonderful, diverse group of panelists provide real-world examples of developing technological interventions in healthcare settings. And so with that said, I'm going to turn it to the panelists to introduce themselves and share a favorite quote to break the ice. And we'll start with Chris.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Chris Almario. I'm a gastroenterologist and health services researcher at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. And had trouble figuring out my favorite quote, but I finally settled on one. So it's from Conan O'Brien in his commencement speech at Dartmouth. And he said, "The beauty is that through disappointment, you can gain clarity, and with clarity comes conviction and true originality."
Love it. Thank you, Chris. And now, Daniel, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Ray. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Twine Clinical Consulting. I'm based in Park City, Utah, where it is a beautiful day. My favorite quote, actually, you know, I have a confession to make, Julia. I didn't pick a favorite quote. I don't know if I have a favorite quote. If I did, it'd probably be from like the movie Fletch or Caddyshack or something. It didn't seem appropriate. So I came up with a quote that I thought actually helped tee up some of the concepts that I think are pretty important to get at in this session. And the quote is, that's from Winston Churchill: "True genius resides in the capacity for evaluation of uncertain and conflicting information." That idea of uncertain and conflicting information, it resonates for me because I see that as what doctors have to deal with every day. You know, when it comes to diagnosis, when it comes to treatment, they're just kind of deluged with information, too much information all the time. And there's studies that are recent that show that doctors would have to read 20 journal articles a day, every day, to be able to keep pace with the information, new information coming out, that they would have to unlearn and relearn the entirety of what they learn in medical school every 5 years to keep pace with it. So it's just this huge amount of information all the time. And in the face of this sort of, I don't know, tsunami of information complexity, it begs the question: how could they possibly be expected to keep pace with that? How could uncertainty not creep in to decisions about diagnosis, decisions about treatment plan? And I think the key point I want to make is, you know, that level of complexity inevitably leads to uncertainty, and uncertainty inevitably leads to variation in care. You end up with what I think of as a sort of a spectrum of care, and reasonable people will reasonably interpret a clinical scenario and be kind of working in the middle here. But sometimes people make decisions based on different scenarios. Well, there's lots of different reasons for it, but they end up practicing out here on these margins. And out here, this variability in care really is the underpinning for poor quality and high cost in care. So I put up this quote to tee up this concept that variability in care is bad, and that variability in care is the underpinning for poor quality and high cost. And it's what, you know, kind of collectively we should all be trying to focus in on and rein in. So that was the reason for the quote selection.
I agree. That was very thoughtful. Thank you, Daniel. And Cynthia?
Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Kozik, and I work for Takeda Pharmaceuticals, and I'm a manager of independent medical education, neuroscience, and specifically more in MDD. And I chose a quote from Ben Franklin, which I thought was appropriate for today. And it is, "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, and involve me and I learn." So I thought that was very appropriate for today's discussion and why we do what we do in medical education.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And I'm not getting off of this easy. I also chose a quote. I don't know if you can see it in here. It's by an unknown author, but it's "Dance first and think later." I think that sometimes it's important to be thoughtful before you take actions, but sometimes if we spend too much time thinking things through, sometimes things don't get done. So sometimes you just have to kind of go for it. So with that said, I want to describe to everyone kind of the structure of our panel today. We're going to have a few polling questions that we're going to ask the audience. Then I'll briefly discuss and describe the framework. And then we'll have panelists share some examples and have some time for discussion and answers. So with that said, Scott, I think you have the first question. Do you think a health behavior framework, which is again a step-by-step process, is necessary to design impactful technological intervention? It looks like 100% of our listeners think that yes. Good. Or should we wait, Scott? Is there a little delay in the answers?
I think it's probably good to kind of wait a couple seconds.
Okay.
And maybe if you guys want to kind of talk yourself. I know that you're going to be talking about this topic kind of as we're going along, but I don't know if there's something specifically you want to talk about in response to this question as some of the results are coming in, or maybe everyone is just responding yes. Okay, well now somebody has responded no.
Okay.
All right, so we can move on to the next question.
And the next question is, in your opinion, what are the biggest barriers to developing technologies that change health behavior? Individual, organization, perception that technology is complex, or all of the above?
So any thoughts on what you're seeing here with the results, Julia, or anyone else?
I think, does anyone else have any thoughts about the results before I go?
I have a lot of thoughts about the results. I don't know. I think every one of these is valid. I would probably, have some different weightings to them. I don't know that they're all entirely equal. I think probably the largest barrier may be organizational, and I can talk more about that in a bit. This idea that technology is complex. Yeah, I mean, of course it is. It's doing this kind of thing is messy. It's not easy, and there's no off-the-shelf version of it. And you really just have to put your boots on the ground and do the work. And if the barrier to doing it is that it's complex, it sort of, to me, feels like a little bit of a cop-out. We don't want to roll up our sleeves and work hard on it. It's sort of how it feels to me, but maybe I'm wrong.
Thanks, Daniel, for that comment. Anyone else on the panel have anything additional to say about this?
No.
Go
ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I feel they're all not necessarily equally significant barriers, but they definitely all are in their own way, which again we can get into a little bit later. But definitely all of them are barriers, but I wouldn't go as far as being equally.
Chris?
I agree with everything that said. Yeah, all are important barriers that we all need to consider when developing digital tools. The exact weighting of it certainly is up for debate, but certainly these are all things we need to consider when we're starting to develop tools that hopefully can be implemented in clinical practice.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So with that said, we're going to go right into our first goal for today, which was to introduce and to describe the IDEAS framework. And IDEAS stands for Integrate, Design, Assess, and Share. This framework was developed by a group of researchers from Stanford University. And what I'll do is I'll use a real live example that fits this framework, and that was developed by Joe Badar, who is a CEO of Partners Healthcare, which is an organization that tries to bridge healthcare with the real world healthcare. I'm sorry, it's an organization that tries to bridge technology with the real world healthcare setting. And so what Joe Badar did is he identified a problem in the population of patients who have diabetes. And the problem was that these patients were overweight and sedentary. And so the second thing he did is he identified, him and his research team identified a behavior that they wanted this group of patients with diabetes to change. And that behavior was that they wanted patients to take more steps. And so with that said, Joe and his team developed survey instruments, both quantitative and qualitative, kind of assess and gather insights from patients with diabetes about kind of their behavior and their activity level. And with that, the next step that they did, and this is all still in this first part of the IDEAS framework, which is integrate insights from users in theory, is they spent a lot of time kind of researching what behavioral framework or what framework in general could help them address the behavior that they were trying to change in this population. And they came up with a model called the trans-theoretical model of behavior change, which is also known as the readiness concept. So based on how ready patients were, they were going to go ahead, Joe and his team were going to go ahead and design an intervention. So the next step was to design. And what they did was they designed a text messaging system. And as they designed the system, they kind of let patients with diabetes use it. And throughout time, they made adjustments and kind of rapidly incorporated user feedback into this text messaging technological intervention. Now, the third step of the IDEAS framework was to assess this intervention. And what Joe and his team did is they ran a randomized control trial where one group of patients received a tracker where they were tracking how many steps they took, as well as a text messaging intervention. And then the other group of patients only received a tracker that tracked how many steps they took, but they didn't receive the very individual and specific text messages. And so what they found 6 months after the intervention was that there were significant clinical benefits to the group that received the digital interventions, the text messaging system. And lastly, the last kind of overarching theme of the IDEAS framework is to share. So what Joe has done is he's published several articles, and he's also published this book, The Internet of Healthy Things, which I suggest that anyone who has any interest in developing technology, it's a great book. So he's published in this book and articles. He's also come out and shared through lectures. And most importantly, he implemented this intervention in the Harvard Medical School. So it wasn't enough just to develop this in research. He really took it a step further and implemented it in a real healthcare setting, and it's still being used. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and ask the panelists to share examples of they're examples of developing digital interventions, and they don't necessarily have to fit this ideas framework, but I'll ask them to kind of describe it and maybe try to connect it to some of the elements from the framework that I just discussed, or maybe any other frameworks that are out there that they'd like to mention. So the first person that I'll ask to describe an example is Chris.
Great.
Scott, if you can put Chris's slides up, please.
All right, thanks, Julia. So again, I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to describe a digital health technology that our group has developed, actually in collaboration with Julia and her colleagues. And it's called IBD and Me. And this is a decision aid to help those with inflammatory bowel disease select a medical therapy. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a gastroenterologist, and I see many patients with IBD, and you'll see in a bit why this is an area that certainly could benefit from digital health technology, in particular decision aids. So, Scott, we can go to the next slide. So before I get into the issue, I just wanted to make a quick comment. So making decisions can be hard. So we make decisions each and every day. And this is just one example, kind of a personal anecdote. So my wife and I welcomed our first child a few weeks ago. She's across the board with my wife. And basically, we were in the process of trying to decorate her nursery. And we were on Etsy, spent a lot of time on that site trying to figure out how to decorate her nursery. And eventually, we got these 3 swatches from a vendor on Etsy. But basically, we were just staring at this. And for most of you, I'm sure you can see they look exactly the same. But my wife and I just agonized over this, looked at it for nearly 30 minutes, trying to figure out. And then eventually we picked one. But still, this is a meaningless decision. Because we kind of took a long time to try to figure out which one we wanted to purchase. So we can move to the next slide. So again, that's just kind of a personal anecdote, meaningless decision that needs to be made. But when we think about our patients, they deal with decisions every time they go to the clinic. So in particular, for our patients who have inflammatory bowel disease, those who have moderate to severe bowel disease, many of them will start to think about the need for a biologic medicine. These are antibodies. These are very expensive medications, but at the same time, the most effective medicines that we have for managing those with IBD. And currently, there are many different options. There's 6 different options, and the issue here is that none of these medicines have been tested head to head. So at the end of the day, our patients with IBD, they are faced with essentially six potential first-line options that they could use for the management of their inflammatory bowel disease. The next slide. So because of that issue, because of this uncertainty, we wanted to, our group at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, in collaboration with Julia and her colleagues, we wanted to create a decision aid called IBD and Me. And it's currently live, and if you're interested, you can check it out. It's at ibdandme.org. And it's mobile responsive. You can do it on your iPhone, tablet, also on your desktop. And I could go on and on about it, but we actually created a short little video that really describes it in detail. So that next, so you can get a sense of what IBD and Me is all about.
Living with IBD can make life a game of find the nearest bathroom. But this isn't even as bad as it could get. Finding the right information about the different treatments can be overwhelming. There's misinformation and downright scary information. Who can you trust? IBD and Me is here to help. There are many ways to treat IBD, and the most effective medicines are called biologics, which help reduce inflammation in your intestinal tract. There are so many biologics to choose from, and they all differ in how they work, when and how often to take them, and their potential risks. How do you know which one is right for you? Developed by scientists at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, a leading IBD research center, IBD and Me helps you navigate through the process of finding the treatment that suits your personal needs. It teaches you about biologics. It answers questions like, when are biologics necessary? What biologics are available? And how common are side effects? When selecting from among the many biologic medicines, figuring out what is most important to you can be frustrating. IBD&E eases your stress using a decision tree process that narrows down the field for you. The software creates your profile by asking you questions like, would you prefer a doctor to administer the medicine in the clinic or do it yourself at home? How comfortable are you with certain side effects? Using this information, the app creates a personalized report that shows what is most important to you in a biologic medicine. Because of this report, your doctor can spend less time asking about your preferences in a biologic. Instead, you both have more time to talk and figure out which biologic best fits your treatment needs and lifestyle. And ultimately, you can spend less time searching for the nearest bathroom. No two IBD patients are alike, and deciding which biologic to use can be extremely difficult. IBD&Me empowers you to learn more about biologics, gives you insights into what is most important to you in a medicine, and allows you to share the information with your doctor. So together, you can choose which treatment is best for you. IBD&Me, helping you find the right treatment for your IBD.
All right, so hopefully that gave everyone a sense of what IBD&Me is all about. And go to the next slide. So just going back to the ideas framework that Julie had described. So just for full disclosure, so we discovered the ideas framework kind of halfway through the development of IBD&Me, but kind of looking back, we actually used a different framework to build it. But looking back, ideas actually fit well in terms of our process for developing IBD&Me. So I won't go into this in detail, but of course it starts with integrating insights from users, designing iteratively with user feedback, assessing, and sharing. And I'll provide some examples on how we approach each of these concepts. So next slide. So starting with integrating. So again, our group we're a health services research group. So one thing that we were very interested before we even started IBD&Me is to get insights from users. In particular, insights from IBD patients. So we do this foundational research and Gastro. And so first off, we use social media data. So we did social ethnography, essentially gathered data from social media data from IBD patients and performed thematic analysis to get insights into what they perceive the risk of biologics and how they approach decision making. And then in our second phase, we use conjoint analysis, a form of trade-off analysis, essentially to quantitatively assess decision making when individuals with IBD we're deciding among different biologic medicines. And I won't go into detail on the results, but we'll just share on the next slide. So for our conjoint analysis, again, this quantitatively assesses decision-making. Here we are very interested to see if there are certain buckets that patients fell into with regard to what they prioritize in medicine. And we found some examples where we could predict, so Crohn's patients, it's a type of IBD, in particular, prioritize side effect profile in their decision making. Ulcerative colitis patients, another form of IBD, they were more likely to value efficacy. But for the remainder of our analyses, we're really not able to predict decision making, which really showed a highly individualized nature of this, and that the clinician, you can't just look at what's in their chart or their IBD characteristics to figure out what decision or what medicine they would prefer. It's really highly individualized. So on the next slide, because of that finding, that was the whole premise behind IBD. So we designed this in an iterative manner. We engaged all the users and stakeholders, the physicians, patients, in the design of IBD&Me, all in collaboration with our computer programmers. And I'll go to the next slide. And in terms of IBD&Me, you got a sense of this from the video, but we start with a learn more section. So here we give patients the ability to learn more about biologics, why they're needed, which ones are available. And we also spend a lot of time going into the risk and benefits. That is something that we found in our foundational research for many of them. And then after they complete the learn more section, the next slide, They then go through our decision tree. So this is again a conjoint analysis, and the whole goal of this decision tree or this test is to really tease out what's important to a patient. And they go through a series of questions, and after finishing that, if you go to the next slide, they actually build them a personalized report. So this personalized report is unique to that individual, that patient with IBD, and it basically takes their answers and is able to figure out what was most important to that individual when they were making decisions among the various different types of medicine. And the whole goal of this is that they can share this with their doctor, and they can have a more thorough, more comprehensive, and hopefully more engaging conversation in clinic, and hopefully come out with a medicine that really matches with that patient's profile. Go to the next slide. So that was designed. Again, we're iteratively developing that. We're actually in the middle of our cognitive interviews, in-depth cognitive interviews with patients. So we're continuing to iteratively update IBD and me. And then going to the A part, to assess. So this is something that we pride ourselves on at our research group. So we're not only interested in building technologies, we're also very interested in assessing them and proving that they work or they don't work. So right now we're in the process of assessing whether or not use of IBD and me. So here we're partnering with the AGA Growth Colitis Foundation and IBD Chorus. So we're actually in the process of testing IBD and me as part of a randomized controlled trial. So you starting off with a patient who is thinking about a biologic or switching biologics, we're exposing them to IBD and me. We're asking them to share that information with their doctor, and then we hypothesize that having that information as part of the clinical visit that may very well improve patient satisfaction, improve shared decision making, and ultimately may even improve medication adherence and even IBD outcomes. So we're currently in the process of assessing that. And then finally, for the next slide, for sharing, so disseminating IBD, so we see this through multiple platforms. So of course, we published on this. So recently in the American Journal of Gastroenterology, there was a Putting Patients First issue where we were able to publish our findings from our foundational research, but also describe IBD and me in detail as part of that publication. Social media, so patients who use IBD and me share they've used this site, and it's helpful. They can share on Twitter and Facebook. Our physician stakeholders have also tweeted about it as well. Working with our foundations, such as the AGA Colitis Foundation, IBD Chorus, and then meetings, symposiums. So earlier this year at the Colitis Congress, we had a session described IBD and me, and then obviously today at Palooza, also another chance to further share and disseminate IBD and me, and hopefully we find it as a useful resource. And with that, I wanted to thank everyone for listening.
So Chris, we do have a question that came in on the educational measures text line. But before we do that, maybe if you can unplug your headset, because your audio keeps kind of going back between your default and your and sort of your headset. I think so I don't know if that's going to be better or worse. But here's the question that came in. So for the IBD and me project, can you tell us roughly how many patients and providers were surveyed to inform the development of the aid?
Right. We're part of the foundational research, so that's basically that was we gathered posts from over 15,000 IBD patients to really get a sense of their decision making. From the conjoint analysis, which really informed the decision tree of part of IBD and me, we recruited over 600 IBD patients, and so that was instrumental in the initial development of IBD and me for probably a little bit more than an MVP, minimum viable product. But that was a number of patients we involved as part of the initial development. And then for the current iteration of IBD and me, we are in the process of recruiting over 20 IBD patients. So in-depth cognitive interviews. Here we sit down with patients, screen by screen, sit down with them for an hour or more at a time, and really getting their feedback on each section of the site. And that is going to allow us to update it for the next version.
All right, great. Julie, if you want to transition to the next section, or if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. We're going to go ahead and transition to Daniel.
Okay, what's on your screen now is just the quote that I talked about earlier, but I think it's a good reminder of the point I tried to hammer right away, was that variation in care is really the underpinning for a lot of the poor quality and high costs we see in healthcare. And a lot of the work that I do focuses on trying to confront this idea of variation in care. And if you think it through, it's not a big leap to conclude that if variation is the problem, then perhaps the best way to improve care is to minimize variation through standardization. And that's kind of the horse that I often ride. I very much deal with and focus on improving clinical process, and what I mean by that is eliminating variation from clinical process. So while it doesn't necessarily marry up exactly with this ideas framework, I think you'll see in practice doing the exact same thing, just call it different things. So I'm going to describe a project, a collaboration between Twine Clinical Consulting and Ochsner Health System down in New Orleans, focused on lupus, systemic lupus erythematosus. And this project was ambitious, I think. We were focusing on a disease that is a multi-system disease that has variable course, that the management of is really complicated. It's a complex disease. And not coincidentally, because of that complexity, there's a lot of variation in care. In point of fact, there's journal evidence that says that the clinical practice guidelines in lupus management are adhered to less than 60% of the time. Another important factor that we identified going into this is that in any given lupus patient, or actually the statistic is 25% of lupus patients in a given year will express a kind of under the radar silent variable that would be predictive of a coming lupus flare. So if they had gone to their doctor and their doctor had done the appropriate diagnostic test, or asked the appropriate question, or observed the appropriate thing in their physical examination, they would have identified this sort of smoldering flare on the way and could have done something to chop it off at the knees. So our intent with this initiative was really twofold: to standardize around, first of all, doing all of the blocking and tackling, as I call it, adherence to the guideline specified lupus management behaviors. That's number one. Number two was to standardize around being just a little bit more diligent, a little more proactive in our approach to monitoring disease activity in lupus patients. And our goal was ambitious, to actually impact the rate of hospitalization among lupus patients. So the first intervention really kind of plays off of the idea that lupus patients, like most other patients, they don't go to the rheumatologist until something goes off the rails. They call up the doctor when they can't see out of their left eye, and they've got a rash, and maybe there's a sore in their mouth. And by that time they've got a flare. It's full-on flare, and good chance they're going to the hospital. So what we tried to do was just be a little bit more proactive, trying to get those patients in to see their doctor with a greater frequency, so that we could enact what we call, quote unquote, tighter management. So the idea was then, so if we get them in more frequently, we can identify those smoldering, pre-flares and treat them and preempt them, or we can identify flares while they're still, kind of mild before they get, to be more severe. Because a lot of times lupus patients, they just kind of live with symptoms. This is their everyday. And there are certain things that they shouldn't live with. They should go talk to their doctor, and we should get aggressive with therapy. And then the last thing we try to do is try to kind of rigorously and systematically implement guideline adherent management behaviors. So in order to do this, it really kind of requires that we get patients to the doctor more frequently. So the first thing we did, the first intervention, was kind of just a slight care process design. We defined a list of patients who hadn't seen their rheumatologist in 4 months. That list every month was provided to a care coordinator. The care coordinator's job was basically just bird dog these patients, get them to schedule a visit with their rheumatologist, get them to go and schedule their labs being taken so that the labs would be available for that point of care interaction. So that was intervention number 1. So scroll on to the next slide, intervention number 2. Okay, so again, our hope was to create, eliminate variation in the way that doctors adhere to the basic blocking and tackling of guideline adherent therapy in lupus patients, but also to create a greater level of stringency or aggression in the way that they monitor disease activity so that we could head off lupus flares. So what we did, this is a screenshot, if it were at all legible, unfortunately. So what we did was programmatically, we embedded what we call the lupus management module, a great example of a digital intervention, I think, into the Epic EHR system at Oxford Healthcare System. Essentially, this thing does 2 or 3 things. First of all, for every lupus patient that comes into an office visit with the rheumatologist, this is the version of the EHR that pops up. This is their home screen. In designing this, we had several goals in mind. First of all, because lupus is such a complicated disease, it's a multi-system disease, and there are data points relevant to the management of lupus that are found everywhere within the EHR. You have to click out of this tab to get into this tab and kind of bounce it around. And the rheumatologist, the feedback we got from them, that it would be useful and valuable to put all of the data relevant to the management of lupus in one spot. And that's actually on the right there of the screen. We have all of the relevant lupus data in one spot relative to all the historical values so that they can see the history. Essentially what we're trying to do here is standardize the data or the information inputs that each of the rheumatologists would have access to and use in their decision. So basically we're standardizing their decision criteria. The other thing that we did here is remembering that there are such poor adherence to the basic blocking and tackling of managing lupus. We created a bunch of alerts within this system so that if they hadn't had a CV assessment in the last 12 months, that doctor got an alert. If they hadn't had a flu shot in the last 12 months, they got an alert. If they haven't measured the double-stranded DNA laboratory exam, that was in the last 6 months, there'd be an alert for that. And double-stranded DNA is an indicator of inflammation, which might point to a kind of a smoldering flare or a reason to be a little bit more circumspect as they evaluate the disease activity. Going back to the other slide, you jumped ahead. All right, and there in the center, the last thing we did, and this is kind of the linchpin of all of it, as it turns out, in evaluating disease activity, it's really a subjective thing. It's a difficult thing. There's so much going on with lupus patients. One visit, maybe they've got a manifestation in their eye, but not in their skin. The next, it's in their skin and not in their eye. And it changes all the time. So it's very subjective about how to identify the activity of lupus. It turns out, though, that there are various scales that are published, validated, primarily used for clinical trials, but we just took one, we repurposed it, and we embedded it for clinical use within the EHR system. So we programmatically embedded this SLE-Day, it's called, SLE Disease Activity Index. Essentially, it's just prompts the doctor based on lab results, based on their physical examination of the patient, based on the patient's answers to questions, kind of takes the doctor through each of the different systems and the typical manifestations of flare within a lupus patient, and they just select, they toggle it. Yes, that's present. No, that's not present. Yes, that's present. And at the end, it automatically tabulates an objective, a quantifiable score for lupus disease activity, which really essentially what we're doing here is we're standardizing both the objective analysis of lupus activity, which is really something that really eludes most physicians. At the end of the day, we help put a framework around how to basically standardize, make sure that all of the rheumatologists are evaluating disease activity in the same way. Okay, next slide, please. And then the last thing that we did was in an ongoing way. Well, essentially at the beginning, we cooked up 18 individual performance metrics And these shown here are just the most important ones. But on a quarterly basis, we ran the queries. We sat down with all 12 rheumatologists. We talked about the data. The data was available at the Ochsner overall level, at the level of individual rheumatology offices. It was also available at the level of individual physicians. So we could, say, hey, Dr. Smith, your data looks a little quirky here. What do you think's going on? And everything was transparent. Nothing was, nobody was blaming anybody for anything. Doctors love data. They want to see how they do. They want to see what happens with their patients. So it was very much a constructive conversation. In effect, what we did is we changed most of the individual physician behavioral metrics in a statistically significant way. Importantly, and again, you can't really read it here, but on the right, we see specific patient outcomes metrics. We were able to change the rate of flare among 580 lupus patients in a statistically significant way. We were able to show a numerical change in the rate of cardiovascular events among lupus patients that did not reach statistical significance. And most importantly, we were able to show a 30% statistically significant decline in the rate of hospitalization among lupus patients. So the key points that I want to make are that what we try to do is we try to focus on eliminating variation in care through standardization. When you do that, you can change physician behavior. And when you do that, you can, in fact, impact patient outcome. That's sort of the name of the game. That's it.
Thank you, Daniel. Scott, are there any questions for Daniel?
There are not any questions as of yet. If you guys have about 10 more, a little less than 10 more minutes, if you want to talk through some of these issues.
Absolutely. So Cynthia, and thanks Daniel again. Cynthia, from a supporter point of view, do you have any examples of grant proposals that you've reviewed or approved recently that you'd like to share that connect to digital interventions and changing health behavior? And then the second part of that question is, what can those who are seeking support kind of do to lead the way forward? If they're seeking support in developing digital interventions to implement in healthcare, what can they do to lead the way forward?
So I was going to talk a little bit about in MDD as far as digital interventions and frameworks. And it's important to follow a framework, but at the end of the day, I think it's so important to know the end user and to keep the end user in mind. And so if the end user of your technology is going to be the patient, or is it going to be clinicians, that you involve them every step of the way from the beginning through all the iterations to the end. And so I think successful digital interventions, you can follow a framework, but as long as you keep that in mind, I think you will be pretty successful. I was going to bring up an example of some collaborative work that Takeda is doing with Cognition Print, and that it's a pilot study where there's an Apple Watch. The individuals with MDD have an Apple Watch, and they are passively and actively, they can do assessments, so it tracks their mood, it tracks cognition, and it's just because it's like every day they're prompted, what is your mood like? Because when not the problem, but the problem with MDD is that a patient will be seen in the office, right? And they'll get a prescription likely from their physician. It'll take quite a while for the medication to work. We don't know if the medication is working optimally. And then by the time the patient is seen back in the office, they have a hard time, remembering, well, what was my mood like? Has it improved? At what point did it improve? Has my cognition improved? And so this wearable technology looks to do that. So on a daily basis, we'll prompt the patient to ask them, what is your mood like today? What are you experiencing any cognitive deficits or impairments? Do you have any symptoms? And all of this information is being tracked on a daily basis. And this is all rich data to bring back to the physician, where, again, shared decision making can come in. If something happens in between, they can call their physician, right? They don't have to wait till that next visit, or at the next visit, all that data is there, and a change can be made, or they can continue on therapy. And so in MDD as well, measurement-based care is extremely important. So you know, different screening tools, so it's very important. A lot of the technology within the watch or other apps that are out there track someone's PHQ-9. They can actively take that PHQ-9 several times a day, once a day. And again, that goes back to the physician, and that's all really great data for the physician and the patient to make decisions. And so that type of technology is extremely important, and it's something that we support and we see real value in.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cynthia. Scott, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, so there's a question that came in through the educational measures text line. This is sort of a common question for a lot of these, and this kind of can apply to all three of the examples you set. You talked about any rough total cost for implementing something like these kind of really comprehensive decision-making tools. Anyone can chime in first.
You know what? I'm gonna take this one, and then maybe we can move on to other questions. From a supporter perspective, I think it's it really just depends on the design of the program and the value that you're bringing. So there's no magic number that's going to fit any of these projects. You have to be kind of fiscally responsible and kind of understand what the value and the scope of the design is. And the only other thing I would mention is that things can be done in phases if there's limited budget available, so everything doesn't have to be done all at once. So with that said, I'm going to ask my panelists to maybe share, one thing that you'd want our audience, and these are folks that are developing technological interventions, trying to implement them in the real health care setting. What would you like to share with them? One thing that you learned from your own experience that could help them. Chris, do you want to go first? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can go first. So really kind of a big couple things that I've learned over my time working in the child space at an academic center is that this is hard. This is hard, and it takes a lot of time. It's a lot of resources to be able to develop these interventions that eventually can bring value. So that's really one thing I learned, but really the biggest thing I've learned, and this has been mentioned before, but it's really involving all the stakeholders early on. So definitely involving physicians, if this is something that's going to be physician-based, if there's a physician-based component, making sure getting them involved early on. If they don't have any buy-in at all, especially at the beginning, it's just not going to get anywhere at all into the flow. And also integrating patients, similar thing there. Like if you don't get patients involved early on, if it's something that you don't find value in, then once you've already built it, put in the resources, and they don't see the value, they're just not going to use it. So I think getting the opinions and viewpoints from the end users early on, involving them throughout the entire process, I think that's how one can develop a successful digital health intervention. But then the last thing I'll say, even if you do all that, sometimes it just doesn't even work at the end. So I can think of a couple of examples.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Daniel?
I think the most important thing that I've learned over the years is, like Chris said, it's hard. There's a lot of barriers to doing this kind of thing. There's organizational barriers within healthcare systems. There's organizational barriers within supporters. There's individual barriers, as the ARS question pointed out. But I think most importantly, there's an art to it almost. Coming up with that way to take a complicated clinical scenario or a gap, marry that up with a data query, which itself is extremely messy, and coming up and refining data is very complicated. Marrying those two things up, and then coming up with a digital intervention that makes sense in context with the clinical scenario and the data yield that you're working with, that informs decision making. You can spin your wheels trying to make those three things come together. But when you can come up with that concept that really does work, you can make a difference. And that's what, at the end of the day, that's what we're all trying to do.
Wonderful, thank you. Cynthia, do you have anything to add to what Chris and Daniel have said?
Yeah, I just think that when you're coming up with like these types of different digital interventions, yes, it's very difficult because you use an app. There's so many apps out there, right? And they may be used once or twice, and they fall off. So you really do need to involve, whoever the end user is going to be to be successful. They have to be involved. You have to get buy-in. You have to figure out what is it you're trying to do. You have to be pretty specific and targeted, I believe. And then I think it also has to be simplistic in nature. So your technology has to be user-friendly. It has to be, if it's going to be more complicated, maybe for a clinician, but it should be simplistic for them to use as well. Otherwise, they're not going to use it. And then there has to definitely be education around whatever intervention you want to use. So you can put the best app out there, but if no one knows how to use it, or you're not going to educate them how to use it, they're just not going to use it. So I think those components, but you definitely have to get buy-in and figure out what problem you're trying to solve and be very targeted.
Wonderful.
All right, great. Well, thank you to everyone. I think we're kind of just out of time for this session. So I want to thank everyone on this panel for a great discussion, lots of really great examples. So for folks who are watching this live or watching the archive version, if there is a short 7-question survey at the top of the live tab, which always helps us to get a sense of who's watching our broadcast and helps us plan for the future. So if you could please take a couple minutes to complete that, it'd be much appreciated. And for those folks who are watching this session live, you just will need to refresh your browser. As soon as this session is over, we will have the next session up momentarily. So with that, I'd like to thank Julia and Daniel and Cynthia and Chris for their participation, and wish everyone a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.